All right, welcome everybody. My name is Emily Barony, and you're at VISIONALITY's Building Forward webinar series. You know how we do this. It's a hot topic in 25 minutes or less, and then we're going to open it up for sharing and questions and comments. I am so excited to introduce my colleague, Kari. She and I are going to talk today about navigating living a mission-based life and working in really intense mission-based organizations and dealing with the natural grief, the unavoidable grief and rage that comes along with living in such an emotional environment. So Kari, welcome. I'm so glad to have you. Let's start our timers, our 25-minute timers.
All right.
So why are we talking about this topic? Give me the highlights. Give me the high level stuff.
Yeah. Well, the first two things that come to mind are, number one, most people who are involved in doing mission-based work are doing it for a reason, right? They're bringing something with them. If I'm working at a cancer center, I probably chose that work because I have a complicated health history or I have a family member with a complicated health history. If I'm working in homeless services, often my life has been touched by being unhoused myself, or same with recovery, right? So many people that choose mission-based work are people who are bringing their own unmetabolized grief with them. So they already have that sort of baseline, right? But the other thing is, we don't have any, like, we suffer collective grief all the time, but we don't have any collective ways of actually acknowledging it and metabolizing it. And when we are people who are already bringing unmetabolized grief to our work, and then we're compounding that by adding more grief and trauma on top of that, what we're doing is we're making it actually harder for ourselves to function in a way that is not only healthy for us, but that is actually going to serve the larger community. So I think if we don't start having these kinds of conversations, especially given the climate change and the COVID pandemic and all of these other things that are starting to happen, then we're going to be ineffective.
Metabolized grief is not a phrase that I've heard before, and I love it. Can you just explain that to me, because I think it's brilliant?
Yeah. So, I mean, one of the descriptions or definitions of trauma is when you have some event that happens to you, or some, really painful experience, and there's nobody around to kind of help you contextualize it and help you understand it and help you figure out, like, this is not what life is supposed to look like, or this was an anomaly, or how can we learn from this and move on, right? And so what happens is we end up just sort of storing that, and it gets stored in our bodies and our brains as trauma, right? But when we can metabolize that, when we can have people around us who can help us figure out how to move through that and find a context for it, then we can actually almost compost it, right? We can pick out the stuff, like, where's the good stuff, and then where's the stuff that just goes away.
What are the lessons that I get to bring forward to inform my life, and what is not serving me, and I get to release that.
Exactly.
So we came up with this term at Visionality, and we call them ghosts. And it's when, I think it's maybe synonymous with like a triggering event or with baggage or something, but we just decided to call them ghosts, where there are moments where we show up in ways that maybe are outside of our character or surprising in some way. And what we've found is it often has this tie back to some kind of traumatic event in your past. Are having ghosts indicator that we still haven't metabolized our trauma fully, or is that just part of having a memory and existing in life?
I mean, I think there's some of both of those things in there, right? We have to understand that when people are triggered, or they're burned out, or they're overwhelmed, what we're seeing is not someone's personality, we're seeing someone's trauma response, right? So for example, if I'm walking down the sidewalk in my neighborhood one afternoon and it's getting on dusk and I get mugged on this one particular corner, right? That's a really traumatic event for me. That's really scary. If I don't find a way to sort of contextualize that and metabolize that, not just the like, oh, now I have to, take care of my physical injuries and get my new driver's license and credit cards and all that stuff. But if I don't find a way to sort of contextualize that, literally every time I walk down that stretch of sidewalk, my body is going to tense, right? I'm going to remember, even though the 600,000 times I walked down that stretch of sidewalk before then, and I wasn't mugged, that didn't register in my body, right? That's a sign of unmetabolized grief. It's like, oh, and so if we can't sort of figure out how to reframe what's happening in our nervous system, because our brains do this thing where it's like, I gotta tell a story about that. Well, now my story is that corner is unsafe.
Right.
But is it?
Right. Right.
Yeah.
Interesting.
Yeah. And so sadly, I think that's what happens a lot with mission-based employees, right? Is we've got these stories, like thousands of them rattling around in our heads, and they're connected to things that are responding in our bodies, right? And unless and until we can find ways to sort of connect those things and then ask the questions, is this real? Is, this base that I'm operating from actually reality and rooted in something that is necessary? What happens is we get stuck in this constant loop of fight flight, right? Because your brain is doing exactly what it's supposed to do. I'm trying to keep you safe. Right. But when our nervous systems are in that constant fight flight, we're not able to discern the difference between what's really dangerous and what isn't. And all our minds know is like, I'm going to default on the side of holy crap, watch out, because the consequences might be too big, right?
Yeah.
But we can't work effectively that way. We can't function. We can't be helpful.
No. And talk to me too about the accumulation of ongoing losses, right? None of us came into the pandemic free of loss, free of grief, free of rage.
Right.
And so talk to me, we all came into this global experience with our own past, and we're now going on years of experiencing a collective trauma that many of us were expected to just like keep working, keep showing up, keep acting normally, like whatever normal is. Well, because everyone's going through it. So like, why is this an issue for me if everyone else can show up for work? So talk to me about the accumulation of loss and grief and rage, and specifically how things are different when it's a global shared experience.
Yeah. So sadly, we have these sort of these sort of social contracts around grief, right? We've decided there are certain rules and around grief, what's acceptable, which kinds of things are acceptable to grieve and which ones aren't, how long you're allowed to grieve something and not. And generally those things, all of those rules come from patriarchy, capitalism, colonialism, and white supremacy, right? That's what this country was built on. So that's what all the social contracts are built on, right? And one of the main tenets of all of those sort of pillars of our society is individualism. So we tend to frame mental health burdens as individual, no matter what, without recognizing the collective traits of them and the systemic causes. So we call for individual responses and place the burden on each individual person in order to somehow manage their own traumas, on top of continuing to manage your workload and continuing to suffer the losses, right? because we don't have a sense of being part of a collective. And so this is why when there can be like school shooting after school shooting after school shooting, our social contract says we're going to be outraged for 48 hours, maybe 72. We're going to sign petitions. We're going to post about it on social media. And then we're going to go back to opening our emails and writing grants and, you know, doing all of these things, right? And the problem with not being able to share those things collectively is not only are we not metabolizing our grief, but we're not actually able to access our rage. And rage is the catalyst for systemic change. But when we are exhausted, when we are burned out, when we are operating on just like the bare minimum, right? We're able to complete our jobs because that's habit, right? I know how to answer emails. Yes, I know how to fill out that grant template, that, you know, I know how to continue to go to the meeting and mostly look like I'm paying attention. But we're defaulting to those old systems, patriarchy, capitalism, white supremacy, colonialism, right? Because that's what we've known our whole lives. We're not able to think creatively. We're not able to access what does it feel like to be part of a community? And we're not able to proactively imagine what it would look like to have a different system. And so, yeah, when we are suffering these sort of compounded losses, it's keeping us in this really small, very confined space. And it's also making us believe that there's something wrong with me. Right? So how many hundreds of thousands of people have died of COVID? But I can only really be sad about the ones that I knew personally. And if that was over a year ago, then probably I should have already grieved that. And I should just really be able to suck it up and get back to doing what I'm doing. Right?
Well, I think maybe for the first time in building forward history, she's gonna cry. So let's just hold space for that. And I want to hold space for our colleague in the chat who has shared that they lost both parents on top of pandemic trauma, and like just name it that what we are collectively enduring is unimaginable and it's not fair, and it's like it's a little too much, right? Like it's a little too much. And and I want to bring it back to what you said. You know, there is there's an unwritten societal expectation that grief takes this long. Yep. And I think that's different for the different causes of grief. Mm-hmm. And you know, I like to say that pain shouldn't be compared, and just because something was deeply painful to me based on my experience and my outlook and my personality doesn't mean that it might be deeply painful to you, but that doesn't mean that what I'm feeling is less, or you know, and it is, I guess, you know, that's an interesting look on individualism, right? Where it's like, let's make space for each of let's make space and respect and protect each individual's experience and hold space for that and trust them that what they're living is real and valid and enough. Mm-hmm. And pair that individual respect with collective support and collective understanding. And I'm curious, like, I say all this and still I show up to work every day, right? And I put up those barriers around, I compartmentalize every single thing that makes me cry in the shower after work so that I can be here and have this conversation with you, and I can sign my next contract, and I can make sure payroll happens, and I can renew my insurance, and I can get my car fixed. And so it's both, but I'm not sure how it is both, but it is both. So can you speak a little bit to that? And I want to add one nuance. that I think this is especially impossible to navigate when you are working, when you're living a mission-based life and when you're working in a mission-based organization, because we have people that we need to show up for,
Yep.
and and maybe their lives depend on it.
Yep. Absolutely. Absolutely. Yeah, it is a both and. It is I have these individual needs and I am part of like I'm part of this system, right? It's not like the vast majority of us can just check out of capitalism and patriarchy. Like we just say it's the water we swim in, right? And I think one of the things that we can do that is sort of that can start to shift things is, yes, we all individually have our own ways that we're going to approach some of these things, right? And so like for me, and for a lot of people, anniversaries are a big deal, right? So it's like, man, the anniversary of my mom's death, wow, that's going to hit me really hard, whereas I might have been functioning pretty well before then, right? But I think as we're finding ways to sort of collectively grieve these things, collectively create a container that's big enough for us to hold space for everybody, one of the game-changing things that we can do is see that as part of the normal human experience, instead of, well, I'm going to hold space for you with compassion until you get your shit together and you can function at 100%, right? The thing about, especially with mission-based employees, I think that is a game changer for us is to see that tenderness not as fragility, but as strength, right? You come to this mission-based work to do this work because you have this passion. You have this desire, right? And there's this inner core of rage. So I try to, I describe grief as sadness at all of the ways that all of the things that were lost, or all of the ways that we're not able to share our gifts, whether that's our love with somebody else, or you can grieve the loss of a job or whatever, right? Rage is the like twin to that says it didn't have to be this way. And it should have mattered more.
Yeah.
Right. But until we can start to metabolize that grief, we can't get to that rage. And the rage part is the thing that fuels us to make systemic change, to say, you know what, you're damn right. It didn't have to be this way. And once we can resource ourselves and recognize that tenderness and that care and that sadness as strength, then we can start to come together collectively and go, what will it take to make systemic change? But as long as we stay in our own little individual silos, we're never going to have the resources to metabolize that grief enough to get into the powerful place of rage, right? And so, and again, what happens when we're in that place of not being resourced, we are just status quo. We're complicit with all the old systems. We are just like keeping up. We're just answering the emails. We might be like doing one little extra thing every day, but we're not thinking outside the box. We're not blowing stuff up. And the fact is, most people who do mission-based work came to this work because they want to blow stuff up.
Yeah.
Because they want to create a new paradigm. And so the questions I think we need to ask are, who are we and how do we show up when we're not fully resourced, right? No judgment, because it's not your fault you're not fully resourced, right? But who am I and how am I showing up when I'm not fully resourced? How am I complicit with all of these old systems simply because I'm not fully resourced? And then the game changer is, what would it look like for all of us who are here working in this environment to be fully resourced so we can go blow some shit up?
Yeah. Well, and I think in a lot of our work that can look like treating symptoms, not root issues, right?
Yep.
And And that's because the symptoms in your face, the symptoms in your face, the symptom is often less expensive to take baby steps, right?
Yeah.
The
Yeah.
sources are those four things that you keep talking about: patriarchy, capitalism, colonialism, and white supremacy. Those are big, 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 big words.
Yeah.
Can you break it down for, like, give me an example of the way each of those show up, maybe in my work or in an imaginary organization, just so that we can have just so that we can see it.
Sure. I mean, one of the things is obviously that rugged individualism, right? That like even within nonprofit organizations, there's this hierarchy. There's this like you have to compete with your coworkers almost sometimes for resources, right? And then outside in the larger system, the whole world of like grant writing and all of that stuff is that's that same thing. It's this scarcity mentality. It's this idea that there might be 5 great agencies doing work with unhoused people in Ventura County, but we're going to make each of those 5 compete against each other for the same limited resources, right? And so there's this like it's power, it's hierarchy, it is not understanding and accepting and embracing mistakes and failures, right? It's wanting status quo. We're not, we're just going to keep doing things the same way over and over and over again. It's perfectionism, it's compartmentalizing. Like all of those things come from those 4 systems, right? It's rational linear thinking, as opposed to what if, all of those things are, and again, all of those things are baked into the way the vast majority of us were born and raised. And so it's hard to imagine what would it even look like.
Well, I think it's baked into the way we were born and raised, and it's intensified when you work in nonprofit land, right? And so like tying it back to patriarchy, capitalism, colonialism, and white supremacy, right? The nonprofit industry pays less. And so in order to afford to work at a nonprofit, you either need to agree to live in poverty, or you come privileged in some way to this. What that ends up looking like is, I say this as a white lady working in nonprofits, it means that lots of white ladies work in nonprofits, and that is perpetuating patriarchy and white supremacy as we maintain capitalism and colonialism, which is siphoning wealth to the top and then ripping it down.
Yep.
Right?
Yeah.
That is perpetuating capitalism and colonialism.
Right. And how many nonprofits do you know whose mission actually involves them not existing someday? Right? Like if we really want to be serving our communities, our goal ought to be so damn good at our jobs that we don't have jobs anymore. There will be no unhoused people left for me to serve if I do a good enough job. But that is the complete opposite of capitalism.
Correct.
And so you're living in that paradox of like, well, I need a job, but so I'm going to do just enough, right? And the cognitive dissonance that is required there is kind of painful, but we've gotten really, really good at it.
Entirely painful.
Yeah. Yeah.
Well,
yeah. So for me, this work is about breaking social contracts. It is about coming together collectively with the people that we work with who have that same core strength of passion for what they do, looking at what these rules are that we've all been complicit with, understanding what it's costing us, both individually and collectively, to follow those rules, and then working together to craft a new set of social contracts, at least within my own organization. How are we going to resource each other? How are we going to create a space where there's psychological safety, where we're going to support each other through all of this, where at least within our organization, we're going to stop being complicit with some of these other systems. And then once we start to feel safe and calm and resourced, how can we think about being creative and blowing shit up?
Yeah, and I really vacillate between feeling powerless and powerful. And so when I feel powerless about really big things, thank you, therapy, I look at the places in my life where I'm very powerful, and I'm very powerful in my job, right? And so one of the really big things that we doubled down on during the pandemic especially was the difference between equity and equality. And we're not doing equality. Like equality, the tools that I need to show up at my best are different. Llewellyn's on the camera, are different than the tools that Llewellyn needs. And
Yeah.
I am in a very unique place to say, we're not approaching things for equality. We're approaching them for equity, and we're treating each of us as an individual with an individual set of strengths and approaches and challenges. And it really requires a lot of vulnerability to say, I need this accommodation that my colleague doesn't need. But guess what? Your colleague needs a different accommodation. Like, we each need a different set of accommodations in order to show up as our full and best self. So for me, that has been kind of like the rock that I'm standing on, where I'm like, well, I have the power to do this one thing, and that's to approach my employees with an equity mindset. Like, what's the next step on that? How do we continue within our organizations to build out of this and to move from grief into rage so that we can start to burn shit down?
Yeah. I'm thrilled to answer that question. I want to be cognizant of the fact that my timer went off, or
We've okay, thank you. We have a clear 25 minutes, and so let's wrap up this one question. What's the next step? And then let's open it up for our colleagues to come on and ask questions and share their lived experience, and let's have a conversation.
Okay, awesome. Yeah, I mean, I think there are a few different steps. One of the steps that I think is really, really important is something I call relational mapping. And this work comes from an organization called the Bay Area Transformative Justice Collective. And they look at it as a way to describe relationships between people who turn to each other for support. And I love doing this with different organizations because I think it creates this sort of map of where do people feel psychologically safe and with whom in your organization, right? And I won't go into the details, but if folks are interested in that, I can absolutely talk about that more. So relational mapping, I think, is really great because it starts to give you an idea of how can we have these conversations where people are being vulnerable and it feels okay. Another thing is something I call wealth mapping. And that is, if we start to, again, shift the idea of like, you might need an accommodation and that feels a little skeevy and gross and like, but what if we flip that on its head and say, wow, you have a completely different lived experience and perspective, and that's a huge strength. Yeah. So let's look at all the alternative forms of wealth that people have. I can navigate a bureaucracy like nobody's business, right? I'm a person who knows how to hold space for difficult conversations without having relationship rupture. There's all these different kinds of things like maybe I come from a huge family and I know what it feels like to be held in care and unconditional positive regard, right? So if we start to do a little wealth mapping with our employees, then we can sort of draw out some of those things that make the people that I work with really freaking amazing. And holy cow, the next time I need to navigate a bureaucracy, I'm coming to you because you know what you're doing there, right? So that's number 2. And then number 3 is to have those conversations. What are the rules around grief and rage that we've learned our whole lives that we're following, right? And then where did we learn those? And what's it costing us to follow them? You know, if I'm going to follow the rule that says, you know, I have to be grateful for what I have, focus on the positive, focus on the positive. It could be worse, right? That's absolutely one of the rules that comes from one of those 4 systems. What's it costing me to do that? Right? I'm not acknowledging the actual deep pain and frustration that I have. And it's costing me support because I'm not able to say to somebody, I'm really struggling today. And yeah, I know I have a roof over my head and my kids are really great. And I have this sweet puppy dog at home, but damn, I'm struggling, right? And then we start to write new social contracts with these people that we're in relationship with that share our passions. And I think those are the 3 most absolutely transformative things we can do to start to shift our culture and create spaces where we can grieve collectively.
I love that. I love that so much. Well, I want to invite our colleagues to come on and ask questions and share experiences. And it's okay if it's not the right time to share an experience. Quite early in the pandemic, we brought on a facilitator to have a conversation as a team about our feelings and our grief and our loss and our fear and the unknown. And the feedback that I heard from the team was that it was really helpful. We didn't come up with any answers, right? We didn't solve the pandemic.
Right.
But just the act of holding space and like even saying we're struggling, Emily is struggling, she's going to put on a really brave face because that's her job and she is optimistic to a fault, and she still gets to struggle and she still gets to be afraid, and that's okay, and it doesn't mean we're disappearing. But it was really important for our team. Oh, I see Llewellyn's hand up. Please join us.
Hi, Kari. Thank you so much for being on. I have a comment on a personal level and then a question on a professional level. So it kind of took me by surprise when you said that patriarchy has something to do with grief. And then as you described it, I realized, yes, actually, I completely know what you mean about that, because I am the sort of person who is like a counselor to my friends and my family, and I can do that on a one-on-one level. I could maybe do it on a group level if I was doing it with my female friends and female family members. But to feel comfortable stepping into a position where I am going to try to be supportive of men or of a group that includes men feels like I'm stepping out of a role and I shouldn't be doing it. And it's kind of interesting if I think about, like grief and how we process grief and how funerals are traditionally led by priests and men in the church, and the church is part of the patriarchy in so many religions. And how, what if there's no funeral? What if it's a mass shooting and there's no funeral? What if it's is something that you feel more distance from, but you still need that collective grief? And there are all of these strong women in our families who feel like they shouldn't step into that role of helping a group of men and women through grief because it's not their job. So I'm going to take that and I'm going to be braver about that in the future. So thank you for that. The question that I have is about kind of like, and maybe there's some success stories that you might be able to share, but of taking grief from the individual to the collective in the context of a team working in a nonprofit. Because I think that what you're saying about, people coming with their unmetabolized grief is so true. So you have a team working on a mission, and that mission is triggering their grief, but it's triggering their grief at different times, in different ways, to different extents. Maybe not even everyone comes with that unmetabolized grief. So you have that whole spectrum of people who make up this team. And then how do you kind of like, what's a leader's role in bringing it out of the individual and into the collective for a team, so that people don't have to just kind of swallow it on the job and keep grinding through the day?
Yeah. Well, first, thank you for sharing your perspectives. I really, really appreciate that. It is important for us to recognize the role of patriarchy, especially with like, that's, what are the rules around what kind of grief do we allow men to show, right? We tend to culturally and societally be way more comfortable. Maybe comfortable isn't necessarily the right word, but we expect men to show rage more than grief, right? That's sort of more culturally acceptable and so those are really good things for us to kind of think about, and how are we raising young men to believe what's okay to express as far as emotionality and what isn't. So I appreciate you saying that. Yeah, I think, again, for me, so much of this lies in what it means to be resourced for us, right? And part of that is like getting in touch with myself, like what, so each individual person is going to have, we all have our own nervous systems, right? So what does it feel like for me when I'm resourced, right? If I get up in the morning and I know I'm a social worker and I'm going out to, the camps, and I'm going to work with folks who are unhoused. If I don't know where my rent is coming from next month, then I'm already, my nervous system's already here, right? And then if something happens, like it's harder and harder and harder for me to do my job. And so I think for us as team members to sort of encourage each individual person to think about, what does it feel like when I feel fully resourced and safe? And how do I know when I'm not? And if I'm not, how do I get there from here, right? Because when our nervous systems are calm and when we're feeling resourced, we can discern the difference between discomfort and danger. And in discomfort, we can still access the critical thinking, executive function portion of our brain, right? And so we can be like creative problem solvers. But if our brain is screaming danger, then we're just in rote, like check the boxes, do the old standard kind of stuff, right? So in a team, it's important for us to know everybody's going to have slightly different thresholds. Everybody's going to have slightly different needs, and everybody deserves to feel as resourced as we possibly can. Right. And so if I'm a social worker on a team who's going to go out with, 2 other social workers, and we've got, say, 30 clients we're supposed to see that day. If I'm coming in and I have a child who's on the spectrum and I got them late to school and I'm a little nervous about how I'm going to pay rent, and maybe I don't take 10 of the 30 today, maybe I take 7. And someone else who's on my team who's feeling really a lot more resourced and super calm is going to take my extra 3 people, right? So to have that flexibility to build that collective container of recognizing, and there's no like, okay, well, next time you owe me, right? It's not that, because that's capitalism, that's colonialism, that's white supremacy. We're not keeping score.
Mhm.
Knowing that this is an investment in the entire team, in the work that we're doing. The goal is the work, right? If the goal is to serve this community of people, when we show up under-resourced, are we actually serving them? And if not, then it's our job to figure out how to resource each other. And so that, again, it's a process. It takes time, and it takes vulnerability, and it takes conversations with your teammates. And for a lot of us, it'll take reflection, right? I mean, a lot of us are not comfortable in our bodies. And so even asking the question, like, what does it look like? What does it feel like when my needs are being met? I don't know.
Right. Right.
Right? Especially if
how
I'm
do
a
we tell?
mission-based person who's been socialized to meet everybody else's needs first.
Right.
Like, how do I even ask
Right.
myself that question?
Yeah.
So beginning to normalize those kinds of things. Hey, we want you to be resourced.
Yeah, and the person in that position of leadership either has to be sympathetic to it because they need their own resources, and so they understand it from a personal place, or B, they're going to go out of their way to make sure that it doesn't matter if it's not if they can't connect with that need, they trust that the other person needs it.
Yep.
Or C, it's the person underneath leadership who pushes on leadership to say, this is how this should look.
Right. But that's hard to do if you're not feeling resourced. And, it's these hierarchies, right? Like, we as people who are in positions of power in organizations, it is incumbent on us to always be analyzing the power structure. Always, 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 right? I'm going to walk into a room and have a one-on-one meeting with this person. I'm going to analyze the power structure, right? I'm going to go, oh, I'm a white woman and you are a person of color. I am a 50-year-old woman and you are a recent college grad. I am, right? I mean, because here's the thing, this is relational work. This is absolutely relational work. And that's why it's so groundbreaking, because capitalism, colonialism, patriarchy, white supremacy, they don't want us to form relationships. That's not healthy for those systems, right? This is relational work though. And it's really transformative. And what we need to know is that, one of the 3 most toxic things for relationship is power. So unless we're not constantly analyzing the power and the gatekeeping between us and our clients too, we're not doing it relationally. We're doing it in the old default systems.
Thank you very much.
Yeah.
Kari, I want to bring us back. I feel like we're in this, what is the right word? It's like a moment of cute self-care where, right? Where it's like, I took a bath today. I only worked 10 hours today, not 12.
Yep.
Talk to me about the difference between performative self-care and permanent resourcing, and how does me go from deeply performative self-care and really barely holding on to this, like, I don't even know what it feels like to be resourced, because all I'm doing are these like drips of like, well, couldn't sleep another night, but I'm gonna leave early this afternoon and take a walk on the beach.
Well, and we're rewarded for that in the current paradigm, right? People go, good for you. And again, that's because, like I said, way back at the beginning of this, because we treat all of this stuff as an individual problem. Good for you for taking care of yourself. Good for you for going to therapy. Good for you, right? It's like, you have this problem, you need to solve it, right? But you're right, those little sips of self-care, that's like putting, well, I'm going to age myself here. I was telling my kids, so I have 4 kids and they're in their 20s. And I was telling them, I can remember having like an ashtray full of quarters in my car when I was a teenager and putting 25 cents worth of gas into my car. Like that was actually a thing in the 1980s. And that's what that's like, right? You put like 25 cents worth of gas in your car. And so you're going to get to go this little, that's not resourcing you. That's not sustainable. That is like treading water until, the lifeboat shows up. And what it looks like to be fully resourced is to be part of a community, right? To be able to like raise the white flag and say, I got too much work to do today, or, I need somebody to listen. I need while I vent, or I just need a hug, right? Human beings are not designed to be independent. There is no such thing. There absolutely isn't. Like the oxygen we breathe comes from the plants, the food we eat comes from plants and animals. Like there's no such thing as us being independent. And so being fully resourced requires us to be part of a larger community and rest in that comfortably. And that's something that, for a lot of us is really, really challenging. Like, do I actually trust these other people to meet my needs? And so, yeah, those little pieces of self-care are fabulous. I'm going to take my dog for a walk on the beach, or I'm going to take the afternoon off and, go get a massage or whatever, right? If that's accessible to you. That's not accessible for a lot of people, right? But being fully resourced means that we know, like, I'm resting within this larger community of people. And it's not just when things go sideways, right? It's for the good stuff too. Like it's someone who says, oh my God, I got my CSA box this week and there's so much extra food in it. Come over for dinner on a random Tuesday night. And you can have a conversation about anything and everything. Like it's these vibrant, dynamic relationships that we're in where there's this exchange of energy and we feel safe. Like I can show up as myself. Maybe you're going to come over on Tuesday night in your pajamas and your bunny slippers. Cool, whatever. Wouldn't that be great? All right. I don't have any wine, but I have orange juice. Okay, orange juice is cool, right? How can we exist in community and relationship with each other in ways where we can have fun together, where we can relax together, where I can say to you, I'm actually not really comfortable with that. I'm not really interested in that. And you're going to go, okay, that's cool. Right. And so again, it's not, I wish it was like I can tell you these 4 things to do kind of thing, but it's really, where can we put our time and energy and effort into creating these safe, loving, connected communities? Because we weren't meant to resource ourselves. It's not a thing.
No, here's my very favorite question to ask our guest stars. How do we sell this to our board? How do we, right? If we're operating within a traditional nonprofit structure, and we have for the entire history of our industry been expected to do more with less because we're doing good. How do we start to have these conversations with our board that flip this script, that like doing more with less was actually counterproductive and we can do more with more, and we need to change the way that our industry operates? How do we start to have those conversations?
Yeah. I mean, one thing that I always go back to is especially if I'm coming in from the outside as sort of a consultant, is let's look at your mission. I don't care about your financials. Like, what is it that you say you want to be doing? Right? I'm serving this particular population. I'm going to do it with dignity and grace. I'm going to, whatever. Right. And then let's work from there. Right. So if this is actually what it is that you really want to be doing, we're going to have to get creative, because there are finite resources. That's just the fact of it. Right. But we can't be creative about how to do this mission work if we're over here in scarcity land, if we're over here looking at your spreadsheets and your balance sheets and your ROI and all of that. There's that activates the fight, flight, freeze portion of our brain. If we go at it from the mission side of things, and if you are truly mission driven organization, then this is the land where we're going to live. And that's where we can start to have those kind of conversations. And you hired your employees for a reason, right? And they came to you for a reason. If they read your mission statement, they're on board with that. So everything, I mean, we talk about being mission driven, right? But in the end, I've been on a million nonprofit boards, and we're always talking about the money. I don't want to talk about the money. Let's talk about what we really are here to do. And if we center the mission, and if we center the human beings or the parts of the planet that we say we're supposed to be serving, then the conversation naturally changes.
Mm-hmm. I love it.
Yeah, I see Shakira has her hand raised. I want to make sure.
So I want to also acknowledge that there's 6 minutes left. So I'll be very brief. And it's, I believe, perfectly couched with Emily's last 2 questions, and then your response, Kari. I want to come back to what you said around big communities. So a couple of things. I have worked 100% remotely the entire 2.5 years that our organization has been in operation, in my home, right? Like, as you can see, it's not like it's full of unicorns and rainbows. It's a taupe from the 90s. So why I say this is this question, building up on performative or piecemeal versus connected to communities and how we can grieve through, and then how do we bring this to the board? Throughout these 2.5 years, I have been in a grieving process about multiple things.
Mm-hmm.
So and it ties back to what you also said about rage being directly connected to that grief. So that was like, I'm tearing up right now. That was a big aha for me personally. Mm-hmm. So I really thank you for that. Because rage is what I feel all the time. Mm-hmm. Rage is my coffee. Or the cream in my coffee, I should say. I'm not going to avoid my coffee. So my question ultimately is, for those of us who are highly emotional and highly expressive of our emotions, so many an executive committee meeting, now many a board meeting, I'm bawling. The tears are. How do we normalize in some ways you could say that as letting the steam out, because it just comes, and if you hold it in, then something else will happen. I don't know what, because I haven't let it happen yet, but I'm afraid to see what happens if I don't let the tears come out. That's the first thing. And then the follow-up with, how does it become normalized where then we are not looked at, and this is that patriarchal piece, as, oh, that's an emotional woman. Yep. Oh, there she goes again. Oh, everybody knows that she's a crier. That's very concerning to me as an evolved adult society. Could you speak to that?
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you so much. I love that question, because I'm a rage crier, and I used to work for the Washington State Mental Health Division, and I would go to Olympia, the capital of Washington, for these legislator meetings around funding, and I would cry every time. And I was like 20 something, and there's all these old white men in the room rolling their eyes and patting me on the back and, whatever. Right. Okay, well, my background, my educational background is in human biology. And here's what I know that I tell absolutely everybody. And also, like I said, I have 4 kids, 3 of them are young women. And I used to tell my kids this all the time. That rage crying is like sweating when you're too hot, or it is like farting when you eat too many beans. It is literally, if you take those rage tears and measure the amount of human stress hormone, cortisol, in those tears, it's astronomical, right? When you're crying because your cat died, or, I mean, there's different reasons, there's different kinds of tears. But when you are rage crying, it is literally because your body has too much cortisol and it needs to offload it. It is a physiological, biological response that is absolutely normal. Period. End of story. And I tell everybody that. I will tell people that in meetings. I'm like, if I start crying, it actually means I am better able to access the executive functioning portion of my brain, because my body has now offloaded cortisol. And so I am not in fight or flight anymore. So this is a really good thing, right? Because what we've done for young men is another way to offload cortisol is to physically attack something. So how many young men do you know have punched a hole in a wall, right? I would really rather have them cry, frankly. But societally, culturally, we don't let them do that, right? So another thing that offloads cortisol, which is really, really scary and horrible, is cutting, self-harm behavior. It's not suicidal. It is literally, I have too much stress hormone in my body and I'm trying to get rid of it. So it provides a release. And so when we tell kids, don't cry, we're actually forcing their bodies to come up with a different way to release cortisol. And it's harmful, right? So yeah, the next time you're in a meeting and you start crying, bring out that little factoid. It's like, if it's too hot in here and I'm sweating, it's the same thing, but I have zero control. It does not mean I am too emotional. It is literally my body going, nope, not doing this, taking care of myself. Our bodies are designed to always seek homeostasis. And that doesn't mean like everything's constant all the time, but like our bodies are like, when we get too hot, it sweats. It's like, we got to bring us back, right? That's physiologically, that's our body's job, is to bring us back into alignment. And it's gonna find ways to do it one way or the other. But patriarchy, capitalism, colonialism, and white supremacy have socialized us to believe that certain things that bring us back into homeostasis are not acceptable. So absolutely bring that little factoid in the next time you start crying, and just let people know, like, my body's doing exactly what it's supposed to be doing. And this actually means I'm thinking way more clearly.
Kari, you just gave me a piece of freedom. Thank you very much.
Good. I'm so glad. I'm so glad. Yay.
Well, not a dry eye on the screen, my friends. It's like, yeah. And I want to underscore too, like, being boldly emotional is part of our superpower, right?
Yep.
That's why we're here, is because we are boldly emotional.
Yep.
And, I often, whatever your superpower is, there's a flip side of that coin that isn't societally acceptable.
Yeah.
And being boldly emotional is what uniquely qualifies us to be magical.
Yeah.
And to make the world a better place. But that means sometimes we cry in meetings, which can be really embarrassing when society says it's not okay. And especially when your whole board is a bunch of old white dudes, right? And you're just this little girl crying in a meeting.
Yep.
And I just love this owning that that's part of the superpower. And that's part of why we're here, and that's part of why we're effective. So get used to it.
It is. It is. It is. Yeah, it absolutely is. And that's why you want me here. You want me here because I care. If I didn't care, how effective am I going to be? Right. But you don't get to tell me what it looks like, how I get to express my care. That's, yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
All right, we're getting lots of love in the chat, my friend. We've got a suggestion to do a series on this. We've got a suggestion to do a podcast on it. Kari has a podcast. So we're going to send out an email to everyone who joined us. We're going to include a link to the podcast, and to Kari herself, we also have that relational mapping that she mentioned that we'll send out. But like, this one was a good one. This one I'm going to be thinking about a lot. So I have a feeling it won't be the last y'all hear of this, because this, I think Shakir said it right. You gave me some freedom today. You helped me take back some of my power today. And I just really appreciate you. And I appreciate the vulnerability of everyone here and the sharing of space. And yeah.
Thank you. I'm so glad to have been here, and I really appreciate the opportunity. And I'm happy, if people have questions. I think I just sent you the graphic for the relational map, so I'll send you out the write-up that goes with it. But yeah, if folks have more questions for me, please reach out and let me know. I could talk about this stuff all day long.
Yeah. Well, let's do it. We do this thing once a month, so maybe we make it part of the continuing conversation. So I appreciate everyone, and you're not alone.
Awesome.
All right. Thank you.
Thank you. Bye.